Wow, it's really good to see everyone here today. You know, this is special. This is historic, folks. This is gonna go down in the history of our organization. So, for everyone who can make it, just give one long applause for yourselves for being able to make it here today. Okay, so as some of you know, my name is Max Reed. I'm an organizer and leader within Students in Youth for a New America, and there's a lot of people from Steiner here today, so I'm very happy about that. And so, you know, for all my life, I've been constantly told, I've always wondered to myself, why do so many Americans live in poverty? How come we don't have health care for everyone? You know, why does the economy depend on, you know, random financial speculation in derivatives markets? Why does the government have to borrow money from cartels and from banks? Why can't the government issue money itself at a fixed rate and with national credit? And I've been told, well, Max, we can't have that because that's socialism, that's communism. And I've been constantly told that socialism and communism don't work. I've been told it killed a gazillion, bajillion people. You know, it's whatever the Black Book of Communism says, it must be true. You know, it's the most factual book out there. I was told, you know, in middle school, high school, I read Orwell, 1984, and like this very, you know, so in Orwell's Animal Farm, there's this character named Boxer. Now, Boxer is supposed to represent kind of the proletarian, and then there's this character named Napoleon. He's the fixin' character for Stalin. Now, Boxer works on the farm after the revolution happens, and they kick the human out and the owner, and they have the farm, and they're building up the farm. And Boxer works really, really hard, more than any of the other animals. And by the end of the book, however, Napoleon sells Boxer. He sells him out. He sells him to a glue factory and to turn him into glue. And I'm like, there's this vulgar anti-populist edge to it. It's like, oh, the revolution's being sold out. You can't trust the broad masses, the dumb, stupid people like Boxer, the horse. And I think when I look at history, that's not what happened. When the Soviet Union was industrializing, Stalin and the Communist Party weren't selling the people out. You know, when the Germans invaded the Soviet Union, if Stalin and the Communist Party sold the people out, then the Germans might have won, but they didn't. And guess what? You know, if it wasn't for the Soviet people and their support for their Soviet motherland, they wouldn't have been able to drive that failed, you know, vegan art school applicant back to Berlin itself. So, you know, he sounds like a bread tuber almost. It's amazing. Yeah, but the only way the Russian, Ukrainian, Baltic, Belarusian, Kazakhstani, and all these peoples were able to unite together and to have an economy that worked and defended their homeland was through socialism. When the Soviet Union was formed in 1923, it was facing unimaginable conditions. We can't imagine what the Soviet Union was facing at this time. The Soviet Union had just gone through, Russia and its surrounding countries had just gone through the First World War, which resulted in millions of Russian and other oppressed nations, peoples dead. It had gone through the Russian Civil War, where 15 different capitalist countries invaded Russia in order to basically take it over and defeat Bolshevism and install people like, you know, Kornilov or, you know, all these military generals and maybe another czar. So we can't really imagine what these people went through. So in response to this, Lenin started the new economic policy, and he promoted a strong national industry while also allowing room for artels and small firms and the middle peasants, the kulak class. And this helped develop the necessary productive forces within Russia, which then gave way to eventually the 5-year plans. And you know, we're constantly told that socialism doesn't work, it doesn't do anything for the people, it only starves people, it doesn't improve living conditions, but this isn't true. This is the big lie. You know, when they say they say if you repeat a lie like big enough, you have to lie big if you're going to lie, because people don't believe small lies. You know, everyone has told a lie once in their life before, and usually people get caught for it because it's a small lie and it's not believable. So when you lie, you have to lie big. And this is the big lie that's hanging over America and over the West in general, that socialism doesn't work. Because amazing things happened during the 5-year plans during the 1930s and 40s in the Soviet Union. And I'm just going to get into that. Tristan, if you could come up here. So the first part of this lecture is going to be about socialist construction. So yeah, socialist construction. You're doing great. So yeah, it's really incredible when you hear about these kinds of things. Villages and peoples, for centuries, you know, were living in darkness. They were living in, you know, huts. They didn't have any food stability. They didn't have running water, electricity. All of this changed in Russia and in the Soviet Union. You had a situation where people found themselves from living in huts to modern apartment buildings. You had a huge electrification. The rate of electrification, and these are from the Library of Congress, these statistics. So this is our own government. They admit this, so you can look it up yourself. The rate of electrification was 10 times during the period of the 5-year economic plans. Coal production multiplied by 3 times. The Soviet Union built 20 new tram systems. They built 80 new bus systems. Hospital beds in rural regions doubled. The USSR at this point, during the 5-year plans, as a result of them, built the largest tractor, locomotive, and steel industry in the world. Nothing before had been done like this. And this was also done during the Great Depression, where the capitalist countries were in the throes of the worst elements of the Great Depression. The Dust Bowl was happening in the United States, in Britain, France, Germany, all across. People were impoverished and people were on the brink of starvation. And there was political instability everywhere. Whereas in the Soviet Union, they were building a new civilization, industrializing. What took the capitalist West decades upon decades upon decades, they did this in just a process of a couple of years. So after World War II and after the Soviet Union managed to liberate Europe from fascism, they repeated this process. In Romania, for example, under socialism, between 1950 and 1971, infant mortality was reduced by 75%. Hospital beds per 1,000 people doubled. In 1945, only about 27% of Romanian people were able to read or write. By the 1970s, according to our government, the Library of Congress, illiteracy had been eradicated. How can people say this isn't progress? You know, in Germany, in the eastern regions, the regions of East Germany, these were hit worse by World War II. This is where a lot of the fighting happened between the Red Army and the Wehrmacht. The Red Army, after they liberated Europe from Hitler and from fascism, the German people, the people themselves, found themselves in a desolate wasteland. 46% of the 1939 male German population was dead or severely wounded. Europe was in complete catastrophe. People were on the brink of starvation. Millions of people were being liberated from the concentration camps, so there was a health crisis with that. And it was just a complete mess. And as this happened, FDR died in early 1945, and Truman came to power. And with this, we saw the vultures of Western capitalism. Even before Japan and before Hitler were defeated themselves, they already were starting to swoop in and decide the future of Europe. Not according to the wills of the people, but according to the wills of London and of Washington, D.C. And in order to do this, they basically set up the Bretton Woods system, which was this international banking system where people's economies would be basically attached to U.S. exchange rates and attached to the U.S. dollar and the oil economy. Now, this program basically made it so that Western Europe was going to become a colony of the Atlantists, of the large faction of capital which allied with the Soviet Union during the World War II in order to defeat the fascists. But not all Europe wanted to go along with this program. In East Germany, and this is really something to be proud of, in East Germany, in resisting the West German mark, in the 1940s, in the later 1940s, East Germany the West were trying to take over East Germany. They were introducing the mark, the German mark, the Western mark. And the East didn't want this because this would flood the economy and destroy the economy. And this was also in violation of the post-World War II agreements that the Soviets and the Allies made. So the East Germans, recognizing and already seeing the renazification of West Germany within the intelligence agencies, within the military, and within the bureaucracy, they decided to form the German Democratic Republic, the first German people's state. Yeah. And the people who formed the state, this was the Social Democrats and the Communists who merged into the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, the Christians, liberals, and patriotic anti-fascists, and they proved to the world that, in order for, reconstruction, for democracy, for development, you don't need to employ former Nazis in your intelligence organizations like Reinhard Gehlen. You don't need to keep the companies which contributed to the Holocaust, such as IBM, Siemens, Volkswagen, or any other fascist cartels in your economy. You could expropriate them. In the GDR, especially out of all the Eastern Bloc countries, the German Democratic Republic excelled at healthcare, infrastructure, and living standards. Just going into some statistics here. After World War II, all the railways, all the roads, all the hospitals and schools were rebuilt. There was a near eradication of infant mortality with a 99.7% reduction of being observed between 1950 and 1984. Through central planning and the 5-year plans, yes, what is it?
I have a question real quick.
Yeah.
You said that this can actually be found from the Library of Congress.
Yes. They have all these, yes. If you look into, just for a note, if you look into the country studies of particular countries within past or present, the Library of Congress admits this, and they have the statistics available for you.
CIA fact book.
Exactly. There you go, Tristan. Yeah.
Could you repeat what GDR excelled in?
They excelled in particularly healthcare, infrastructure, and also the lack of infant mortality. Just getting into some more statistics. Through central planning and through the 5-year plans, they had an annual growth rate in GDP of about 5% per year. That's unimaginable for even today in America. 5% per year is great. And during the 1970s, and no one will talk about this, the GDR had a higher standard of living per person than Great Britain, one of the biggest capitalist nations. North Korea, also known as the DPRK, or Democratic People's Republic of Korea. And we often hear about the hardships that the Korean people suffered, and this is true. Millions of Korean people were butchered and died during the Korean War, which was forced on the Korean people by the imperialists in the West, and the United States in particular. And they've suffered hardships since the fall of the USSR. Clinton introduced kind of an oil blockade and basically starved the Korean people of necessary oil that they would use in their tractors to then produce wheat, and that led to a food crisis in Korea. Luckily today the situation's stabilized, but it's still tenuous, and it is hard in Korea today thanks to the policies of the US and US imperialists. But going into some successes, from 1948 to 1990, the life expectancy in the DPRK increased by 30 years. In 1955, North Korea only had 285 hospitals throughout the entire region. By 1986, it had 2,401 hospitals. Talk about progress. Illiteracy was wiped out, universal education was created, and in the initial years after the Korean War, with the support of Soviet and Chinese investment into the economy, North Korea actually had higher industrial production, higher living standards, and just a better economy in general than South Korea. This was before Park Chung-hee basically drag marched Korea kicking and screaming into an industrialization through Bonapartism. So for a long time, the US puppet state in the South, the quote-unquote Republic of Korea, look up the national security law to see how much of a republic that is. Right. But for a long time, South Korea languished economically while People's Korea prospered. China, this is a big one, folks. Once known as the sick man of Asia, the fractured warlord-run region of China, the corpse of former great dynasties which united the Middle Kingdom, or Zhongguo. China was used as a captive market for the 19th and 20th centuries by the British, French, Japanese, American, and German imperialists. A good proportion of the population within China was addicted to opium. Imagine that, and we can actually imagine that today in America. We have a serious opioid epidemic in America. Only a tiny % of Chinese people were literate. Most were peasants and were basically held at the ransom of landlords and cyclical famines, which would happen every year from drought and the lack of a central government in order to organize relief. Now, this was before the rise of one party, which has transformed China and our world. Let's be real, our world as we know it. The Chinese communists, upon coming to power in 1949 on the support of the Chinese people, transformed their country. Opium addiction was wiped out, and this was through a campaign of reform and rehabilitation for people. Literacy campaigns began to educate the Chinese people. They simplified Chinese to help people become more literate. There was land reform, and this gave land to the peasants. It took land away from these toxic landlords who were holding back economic growth, and it gave it to the peasants so the peasants could have a say in their economy and how they would eat and how they would run their own affairs. But in the Communist Party, in the later part of the 20th century, eventually realized that they kind of escaped a key element of Marxism, which is that you cannot build socialism or communism on the basis of poverty. You can't build a purely communist society, no matter what you do culturally or politically, on the basis of a lack of industrialization and a lack of modernization. So to quote Deng Xiaoping, quote, "Poverty isn't socialism, but to be rich is glorious." This is a principle in Marx's critique of the Gotha program, which is really important. And this is why we say that we are not against, the principle of saying we're against billionaires. We're not against billionaires. Everyone in a socialist or communist society would basically have the wealth of a billionaire today. Like, for example, in feudal Europe, to have a mirror, to have something like, something like this, or glass planes, that was a luxurious item. Nowadays, everyone has that. So in the future, we would probably have spaceships, and we'll have really advanced stuff. Yeah. But through Deng Xiaoping and the reform and opening up, China has become the power it is in the world today. And they kept with central planning, but they introduced worker cooperatives and small firms into China and the market sector. And through this, China has become the #1 electronics manufacturer in the world today with Huawei Technologies. It's become the #1 steel producer in the world today. It's become the #1 economy in the world today per PPE. Extreme poverty in China has been eliminated as of 2020 in schedule with Xi Jinping's moderate prosperity. Now, and there's also the fact that only one economy managed to grow during the COVID-19 pandemic, which brought catastrophe to the US economy, and that was China's economy. And these facts are solid, and these facts are part of history, and they're part of today. Socialist construction works. There's no other way to put it, folks. So quickly, I just want to talk about a couple other major socialist projects that built a really, really huge infrastructure. So in Gaddafi's Libya, there was the great man-made river. Now this was constructed, this irrigated all of Libya. This brought water to Libyans, this brought industrialization, and this helped electrify Libya. The Dnieper Dam during the 1930s was constructed in the USSR in 1931. This was the largest hydroelectric power dam in the world at that time. And later, the Soviets helped Egypt build the Aswan Dam, which brought electrification and running water to all of Egypt, and even electricity to Sudan as well. Another example, the longest and highest elevated road in the world today, the Pakistani-Chinese Friendship Highway, that was built in China under Mao Zedong. And let's be real, who invented space travel? Who invented the AK-47 rifle?
USSR.
Who invented the first mobile phone? Okay, well, the results speak for themselves, folks. So where does this idea that socialism doesn't work come from? You know, any economist who's worth anything is going to tell you that the main period of economic expansion, which is what happened in the post-World War II period, there has been never any point in history where there was as much growth as there was after World War II. This was because socialist countries were industrializing. They were building roads. They were pulling people out of poverty. They were giving people jobs. In capitalist countries, you had social democracies. You had strong welfare states. You had healthcare. You had national industries that were very strong. And in third world countries, in order to stave off communism, you had the rise of Bonapartist regimes. You saw people like Park Chung-hee. You saw people who would build a strong national industry, but for private ends, but would keep it privatized and would fight communism. So this idea that free markets and just deregulating everything and letting the markets run wild results in economic growth isn't true. It isn't true. It's the myth of the 21st century, and we're going to do away with it. All right. Kristen, if you could come up here. So part 2 is going to be on the Comintern, so we're going to get into that. Yeah, that's good. Okay, so after the Bolshevik Revolution, you had the birth of the Third International. This is what we call the Comintern. This was, just to give a little background, the First International was established by Marx. This was known as the International Working Man's Society. Now, this collapsed thanks to the anarchists and Bakunin specifically doing infighting. And then you had the Second International. These were the major Marxist parties within Western Europe in the 19th and early 20th century. Now, this also collapsed as a result of World War I, when these parties would chauvinistically throw tens of millions of their own workers and sons to die in the trenches of World War I. So out of World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution, you had the formation of the Third International. And this international was meant to direct Comintern affiliates, people who were sympathetic with Lenin and the Bolsheviks, who were against World War I, was meant to kind of direct them politically, to what one might say to promote political innovation in a way. Yeah. So in the beginning of the formation of the Comintern in the Soviet Union, you had a lot of confusion about Bolshevism in general. Most people who supported the Bolshevik and the Bolsheviks and the Bolshevik Revolution mainly supported them because they were violent and they overthrew the Tsar and they were ultra-revolutionary. Now, this was mainly anarchists, and this actually left a lot of barriers between Bolshevik affiliates and Comintern affiliates within Western countries and their supposed working-class base, who were still loyal to these socialist parties, which were still around and still very big. So the first struggle in the Comintern was against ultra-leftism. It was to define what they were and to not have any unnecessary barriers between themselves and the masses. For example, in Britain, you had the Zinoviev letter. This was in 1923, I believe. This is when a figure within the Soviet Union, supposedly, this was a forged letter, sent a letter to the Labour Party of Britain, which was part of the Second International, wasn't Bolshevik, and basically told the Labour Party that we like you, we like what you're doing, and you should create, a Bolshevik socialist Britain. And this was thrown around by the Tories and the Liberals, and this was used to basically get rid of the Labour government in Britain during the 1920s.
Russiagate.
Russiagate, exactly, there you go. Yeah. So at this time, Lenin basically said that it was necessary for communists and Comintern affiliates within Great Britain to actually defend the Labour Party, but at the same time go into the Labour Party and expose the reformist and sellout nature of the leadership of that party, and why Bolshevism was necessary in order to actually get the things that the Labour Party was advocating for. So, and Lenin said that the communists within Britain would be supporting the Labour Party just as a noose supports a hanged man. And this isn't the same thing as dogmatically voting or supporting bourgeois parties or even like worker parties. A lot of people like to take that quote out of context by Lenin that they should support the Labour Party in order to enter it. Exactly, yeah. And let's be real. At least the Labour Party supposedly at this time was a socialist party. The Democrats in America have never been and never will be a socialist party. Yeah. So another example of this fight and struggle against ultra-leftism is actually what happened in the the late 1910s with William Z. Foster. Let me just put him up here. Yeah. So William Z. Foster, when he first started out, wasn't actually a communist. He wasn't in like the Comintern affiliated two parties which existed at the time. He was the leader of the steel strike within America, so he's still part of a faction of the AFL at this time. This strike gripped the nation. It shut down the entire steel industry in 1919. It was like 700,000 workers. It was very, very big. It was so large that even the president, Woodrow Wilson himself, actually invited William Z. Foster to the White House to negotiate. And it's really funny because Wilson thought Foster was some uneducated brute, so he put on a gruff accent and talked to him like this. But it wasn't true. William Z. Foster was pretty educated, so that wasn't really, it was kind of funny. Now, Foster at this time was actually at odds with the two communist parties which existed that claimed to be affiliates of the Comintern. There was the Communist Labour Party of America, which were the English-speaking exiles from the English-speaking workers and intellectuals from the Socialist Party, and then the Communist Party of America, which were the foreign language federations that split off from the Socialist Party after the Bolshevik Revolution. They actually, these two communist parties called Foster a class traitor. They called him Easy Foster. And it wasn't until William Z. Foster attended an international trade union summit during the 1920s in Moscow that he actually met Lenin, and Lenin told him, hey, we don't like what these two quote-unquote Comintern affiliates are doing. They should have supported the steel strike and they should have supported you. And Foster was like, okay, cool, I guess I'll join one. I guess we'll form, and then eventually you had the formation of what was known as the Communist Party USA. Foster joined it, and the Communist Labour Party, the Communist Party of America merged and formed what is known as the Communist Party USA. So later, going into the 1920s, you had the Comintern had to reorient itself. The revolutions of 1918, 1919 were mainly defeated everywhere but Russia, Mongolia, and some other places. Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg in Germany were murdered by Social Democrats and Freikorps. Bela Kun and the Hungarian Soviet Republic was crushed in Hungary. Romania and Czechoslovakia invaded Hungary at the behest of Great Britain in order to crush the Hungarian Soviet Republic. And the Reds lost the Finnish Civil War, unfortunately. So the revolutionary momentum kind of post-World War I had really slowed at this point. So at this point, the Comintern created the period of the United Front. During this period, you saw the Comintern parties, orient themselves to center themselves on, working class demands with working class coalitions with other parties, which would be able to unite the broad masses. In America, the Communist Party USA organized with the Farmer Labor Party and tried to, gain influence and organize within the AFL. Within China, you saw the Communist Party of China join the KMT, which was the nationalist party, and it was anti-imperialist at the time, and it was supporting liberation from the Japanese and outside imperialists. this policy wasn't merely this wasn't a concession to like center-left or reformist organizations. It was basically a mean for scientific socialists and Marxist-Leninists to basically get back in the existing labor movement that they kind of were isolated from after the Bolshevik Revolution, and to build up a broad base with scientific socialist politics. Now, eventually, as you get further into the 1920s, you have another shift that happens. In 1929, the stock market crashes, and the Great Depression occurs. About a year ago, the Comintern actually theorized that this was going to happen, and that the period of capitalist consolidation had basically ended, and that the period of revolutions was now about to take place. This was what we call the third period. And just to give some context, there was a lot going on in countries that resulted in the shift in Comintern line. In 1927 in China, and Sun Yat-sen died. Sun Yat-sen was the revolutionary. He put forward nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. People's livelihood was understood to be a kind of form of socialism. Now Sun Yat-sen dies, and this guy called Chiang Kai-shek, or Jian Zhizhi, takes power. Now, Chiang Kai-shek doesn't believe in any of that. He's an anti-communist, and he wants to crush the Chinese communists that are in with the KMT and are gaining influence within the KMT. So you have the Chiang Kai-shek takes control of the Comintern, and he begins to slaughter the communists. You have the Shanghai Massacre, which begins the White Terror, where hundreds of thousands of labor activists, trade unionists, and communists get killed, like just executed, rounded up in the streets by gangs and KMT forces loyal to Chiang Kai-shek, and they just kill them. So it's at this point that Mao Zedong wins the factional struggle within the Chinese Communist Party and says, hey, we're getting slaughtered in the urban centers. We need to actually go to where the peasants are, get out of the major cities, and go to the countryside. So this is when Mao Zedong forms the Workers' and Peasants' Red Army of China. So in Germany, another example of why this shift toward the third period happened. In Germany, you had the Communist Party of Germany. They were in really sharp conflict with the Social Democrats, or the SPD, the supposedly Marxists that killed them in 1918 and 1919, that threw Rosa Luxemburg into a river, these Marxists. There was the Blut Mai incident, or the Bloody May incident, when in late 1927, the SPD banned communist demonstrations in Berlin during May Day, Workers' Holiday, International Workers' Day. This is a major holiday. And the communists, in response to this, organized in the Wedding district of Berlin, which was a communist-dominated district, and they assembled for May Day, regardless of the Social Democrats. And this resulted in basically a war within Berlin itself. There was shooting, there were barricades set up. It was like a low-intensity conflict that happened here. And by the end, 30 German communists were killed by the Social Democratic Party and the Berlin police, which was controlled by the Social Democrats at the time. It was so blatant, the police were so politicized that the Berlin police actually wore their party badges for the Social Democratic Party when they went out to kill communists. Now, so it's in this situation where you have communist parties that are under attack by Social Democrats who are in this anti-communist frenzy that you get the politics of the third period. At the Sixth World Congress of the Comintern held in 1928, you had the formation of this period, the United Front from Below. This was basically instructing communist parties to take on the strategy of, instead of attempting to unite on a common basis of demands with the leadership of social democratic parties, to instead go into the social democratic parties and target the base of their parties and expose the reformist sellout nature of the leadership, the pro-imperialist, social fascist leadership, as sellouts. And this was where you get the phrase social fascist from. They preach socialism, but they practice fascism. Do I have to sing the rhyme? Do you want to sing the rhyme?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, the Cloak Makers Union is a no-good union. It's a company union of the bosses. They right-wing cloak makers and the socialist fakers are making for the workers double crosses. And the Hill Quit-Stabinskys and the Thomases are making the workers false promises. They preach socialism, but they practice fascism to deserve capitalism by the bosses. Hoo-ha! Okay. Yeah, so again, as you have, going into the 1930s, you have the rise of fascism within Germany, with Hitler coming to power in 1933. Not through a democratic vote, by the way, just through a coalition with other right-wing parties. there's a lot of liberals who say Hitler was elected democratically as a attempt to prove some kind of point. But he wasn't. It was a coalition government with conservative nationalists before he purged them, of course. So you have the rise of fascism in Germany, and this really presented a big danger to communist parties around the world. Because when fascism arose in countries, communist parties would be liquidated. Their leadership would be arrested, if not killed. Their membership would be arrested, and there was a complete crackdown, and bourgeois democracy was gone at that point. So at this point, the Comintern put forward the policy of the Popular Front, and this was pioneered by this man right here called Georgy Dimitrov. Just get him up there. Now, Dimitrov was actually famous because he was in Germany during the time of Hitler's rise to power, and he actually got arrested after the Reichstag fire, and he was put on trial, but he embarrassed Goering, who was Hitler's second in command at the time, and he basically destroyed him in open court. And there was so much international pressure by the Soviet Union and other countries that Georgy Dimitrov was released and he was deported to the Soviet Union. But you have the 7th World Congress of the Comintern in 1935, which basically put forward that a popular front should be formed, that communists facing extermination by fascism should seek to form a broad front based upon anti-fascism and should center themselves within this broad front. Now, this broad front is different than the United Front because the United Front is meant to be working class organizations and parties only. The Popular Front was able to include bourgeois democratic forces that were defending bourgeois democracy. That was the whole point of the Popular Front, to defend democracy against fascism. Now, this was put forward also by the theory that capitalism was propelling fascism forward since it was creating a crisis situation for countries around the world. So it was necessary for communist parties to center themselves as the principled fighters and the premier fighters against fascism, from which they could even broaden their base to also include bourgeois Democrats and perhaps, eventually get these forces to eventually support a communist party in the future since they'd have the credence from the anti-fascist record that they'd create. The most notable attempts at a popular front happened in Spain. So in Spain during the 1930s, there was the election in 1936 between the Popular Front. This was the Spanish Workers' Party, the Communist Party of Spain, and other left-wing forces against a right-wing coalition called CEDA, which was an organization of autonomous right-wing parties. After losing this democratic election in 1936 in Spain, you saw a military coup against against Republican Spain, led by this guy called Francisco Franco. Now, this started the Spanish Civil War, which saw a huge contribution from communists. Let's be real. The Spanish Civil War, there would have just been a military coup if it wasn't for the communists within Spain. Let's be real about that. So you had the Communist Party of Spain gained a lot of influence over the Popular Front through the strategy put forward by Georgy Dimitrov. They were very prominent in the army, within the intelligence agencies, and they were the best organized. It was thanks to the Communist Party of Spain that they formed the 5th Regiment, which was a disciplined unit of the Spanish military that defended Madrid in 1936 and prevented Franco from just ending the Civil War in 1936 by taking Madrid. You also had the Comintern organized the international brigades, which were about 30,000 people from all over the world came over to Spain to fight against the fascists. And we, as Americans, we contributed about 2,800 Americans. And 800 Americans volunteered and died in Spain. So we contributed a lot to that. I just want to either have a moment of silence or applause to our contribution to that war. Okay, Tristan, can you come up here again? Cool. So third part of this is going to be mass struggles within the CPUSA. So just mass struggles CPUSA.
Within CPUSA?
No, with CP. Mass struggles CPUSA. So out of all of our history, just in general as communists within America, the greatest expression of the Comintern within America has been the Communist Party USA. Now, regardless of what you think of its current incarnation and regardless of their orientation toward this organization in particular, the Communist Party USA and its history, this is where we come from. This is our tradition. I just want to clarify that regardless of their current incarnation, they don't get a monopoly over that tradition. To the masses! To the masses! To the masses!
We are city builders. We are
City builders!
We are
City builders! Okay, great, yeah. So when the Great Depression happens, the Communist Party begins organizing unemployment councils. These are groups of working class people who are without jobs and are really hungry, and they really do some incredible work. They do a lot of street marches. They surround government buildings. They sometimes even break into buildings and demand, worker wages now, worker wages now. That's their demand. They go over people whose houses get closed during the Great Depression. And the sheriff and the landlord come and they move all their stuff out and they kick them out on the street. The Unemployment Council comes over, organized by the Communist Party, puts it all back. And they stand in front of the house and they say, you're going to have to go through us before you kick those people out of their damn home. And these were very dangerous things to do at the time. I mean, these marches were huge. They attracted a lot of police attention. There was a lot of street battles that happened in New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, all across America during this period. Near Henry Ford's mansion, there was a protest by the unemployment councils and the Young Communist League, and they actually got gunned down by Henry Ford's private security guards, and nothing was done about that. The Communist Party also helped organize the Bonus Army in 1931, and they marched on Washington. These World War I veterans who had been thrown into the chasm and the grinding machine of World War I demanded their damn benefits, which the government during the time wasn't going to give to them since it was the Depression. So in response to this, Douglas MacArthur and Herbert Hoover decided to send in the tanks. They decided to tear gas at the National Mall in D.C. They sent in the tanks. They sent in soldiers with bayonets, and they killed a good amount of people. Everything that they say happened specifically in Tiananmen Square, everything that happened there actually happened in 1931 on the National Mall. Yeah, it's protection. Yeah, there you go. Because the Social Democrats and the Socialist Party USA and other unions didn't allow communists to organize within the AFL, the communists kind of did the reverse to them as well. They did not let the Socialist Party get their hands on the unemployment councils during this period. So they had big mass organizations called the Trade Union Unity League, TUUL, and the unemployment councils, which were really helping organizing people. So a big thing that distinguished the Communist Party USA from the Socialist Party and other quote-unquote left-wing forces was that the communists organized everyone. In the 1930s. Steelworkers, sharecroppers, shipyard workers, everyone. In 1934, this really came to a head in the San Francisco strike, the dockyard strike in San Francisco. So you had a strike by the longshoremen. There was, Roosevelt at this time was president. There was a lot of unrest with labor unions and just in general in the country. And you had the strike. So usually what happened in the past with longshoremen union strikes during the 1920s and 30s was that the shoremen would strike, but because they had a racist union that only hired white people and did not hire people from the black community, black people were brought in as scab labor and the strike would fail and the strike would collapse. Now this time, the difference between this strike in 1934 and the strikes of the past is that the Communist Party, the main organizing force, was anti-racist. The Communist Party paid a lot of special attention toward organizing and forming an alliance with the black community. The Communist Party went to churches, they went to organizing and gathering places, and they said that one of the key demands of this strike in 1934 is going to be that black workers would get hired on the dock. So when the strike finally happened, both the white and black community supported the strike, which shut down the entire city. The organizing enabled the ILU, the International Longshoremen's Union, to have some of the best wages in America today because they were forced to. This port, San Francisco, was a major port. It was taking in a lot of cargo from Asia, and this was a threat to the capitalist economy, so the capitalists had to concede. And the ILU remains one of the most radical unions in America today, thanks to this struggle. So that summer, 1934, this was a wild, wild summer. You had the Teamsters strike in Minneapolis. A blind chicken finds a bit of grain at some points in the day, and the Trots did one good thing, and they organized the Minneapolis Teamsters strike. So they would actually, so basically trucks would go in, scab trucks would go in, and these Trotskyists would actually get bats and smash trucks that didn't have like the Union sticker on them. That's how hardcore these got. Fun fact, Jimmy Hoffa, the guy, that guy, yeah, he actually learned how to strike and how to be tough from the Trotskyists. The Trotskyists taught him everything he knew.
Critical support.
Yeah. In Toledo, Ohio, you had the Autolite strike with the Workers' Party of America and the Communist Party. They shut down Ohio, and they got into armed conflict with the National Guard. I mean, this was an intense situation, folks. In South Carolina, there was a state of emergency. You had the textile unions and the sharecroppers on strike. So this was a really critical point in American history. So Roosevelt at this time had just been elected president. This is 1934. And you had the National Association of Manufacturers, these people. You had Henry Ford and other such swamp creatures. And, they really admired Nazi Germany. They admired Hjalmar Schacht. They wanted to crush the labor movement and impose, austerity and, just beat back the whole labor movement that was taking over the U.S. And these forces actually attempted a coup d'etat against Roosevelt in the business plot of 1933. And one of these scumbags who tried to overthrow Roosevelt was none other than good old Prescott Bush, the grandfather to George W. Bush. Yeah, great president, yeah. So luckily, this plot, which was they tried to organize, they tried to get this man, Smedley Butler, to organize this plot, but Smedley Butler was a veteran, and he realized what imperialist wars were doing to Americans and the soldiers in America, and he said, no, I'm not going to fight for you fascists to turn us into a Hjalmar Schacht-style austerity state. So he exposed the plot, and the business plot was exposed. Unfortunately, of course, none of the major capitalists got prosecuted, of course, because, justice only goes one way in this country. So you had a really critical point at this time. Roosevelt was under attack. You had the business plot, and you were going to see more things like this if he didn't do anything. So Roosevelt at this time takes a turn. He starts to become more radical. He passes the Wagner Act in 1935, which legalized organizing unions in America. If it wasn't for the Communist Party and perhaps a military coup, we would still not have legal unions to this day. And he starts to move left. He sets up the Works Progress Administration and other major programs that are kind of in response to what the Communist Party was demanding, worker wages now. So in terms of unions, going into 1935, 1936, the AFL during this time was still racist. It was still not willing to organize black workers or quote-unquote unskilled workers, industrial workers, and it was a whites-only union. At 1936, at the AFL convention, John L. Lewis argued that, hey, we should end this policy and start to organize industrial workers and black workers. And this actually caused the leader of the Carpenters Union in the AFL to insult John L. Lewis. So John L. Lewis did the logical thing, and he punched him in the face. And he walked out with a lot of people within the AFL, and he walked out and formed the CIO, or the Congress of Industrial Organizations. Now, unlike the AFL, the CIO had no ban on communists joining. And it wasn't a whites-only union. They organized black workers as well as white workers. And this resulted in the CIO, they needed experienced organizers who were working with black and white workers and were militant labor activists. And this resulted in the CIO hiring mainly communists to do most of the organization during this time, since it didn't have experience with sharecroppers and industrial unionism. Later that year, and this was the culmination of this entire period. Later in 1936 and through 1937, you had the Flint Steel sit-down strike, and this was organized by the CIO and the Flint workers in Michigan, and also the Communist Party. So in the Flint sit-down strike in 1936 to 37, you had the shutting down of the plant. They didn't just leave the plant and just picket, have the lines, have your marches. They actually sat down and shut down the entire plant. They seized the means of production, and they held it hostage. So, yeah, so, as always, the police, the Pinkertons, the Black Legion, and the fascists all organized and tried to break them up. And unfortunately, this didn't work. The Flint sit-down workers were pretty fortified. They actually had fire hoses, and they sprayed police with fire hoses in order to defend the plant from the Pinkertons and the police. And this spread throughout the country. You had solidarity strikes all over the country, and you had John L. Lewis himself. He showed up in Flint. He tore off his shirt, and he said, if they're going to shoot anyone, they're going to have to shoot me first. So, yeah, and the National Guard eventually arrived, and the National Guard was sent by Roosevelt, and people were expecting, oh, this is going to be it. The National Guard are going to get their machine guns. This is going to be a bloody massacre. But to everyone's surprise, the National Guard did not point the machine guns toward the factory, toward the workers. They pointed them toward the Pinkertons, the Black Legion, to the fascists, and to those people. Yeah! And this was Roosevelt acknowledging. Yeah. So they were sent by. So these National Guard units were sent by Roosevelt to protect the workers, and this was labor's Gettysburg. And to culminate the strike at the end, when the workers marched out victorious, they had the one black worker at the plant was the one who was carrying the American flag with all the other workers behind him. And whenever people talk about the good old factory jobs or the good old labor jobs and all of that, and like, oh, what America was, they're referring to the wages, unions, and conditions which were only made possible by the CIO and the Communist Party. Communists made the American dream, and we should claim that damn legacy. Yeah. But I think out of all the things we can really take away from this today, just in general, and this is the fourth part of my presentation, if you could come up here. One of the, this is CPUSA and Black Liberation. So out of all the things that communists have done in this country that are seriously impactful and have really impacted the politics of this country, undoubtedly our greatest contribution in general to U.S. society was the struggle for civil rights and against racism. Early on in the 1920s, the Comintern actually basically forced the Communist Party. They basically said that the Communist Party had to be anti-racist. It had to acknowledge that black people in America were oppressed nationally. And the Comintern even instructed the Communist Party to work with black nationalists and liberationists such as Marcus Garvey, because according to the Comintern, black people within America represented an oppressed nation. They were oppressed not only on a class basis, but on a national basis. And there was the Black Belt thesis, which basically stated that the South was part of a black nation and that it deserved self-determination and all that. So in the 1930s, you had the Scottsboro case. Now, this is when 9 black youth were framed up and were accused of raping a white woman on a train and while going for work. And a lot of Americans were train hopping at this time, going around the country looking for any work, looking for food. And basically, the only people who were willing to defend the Scottsboro boys was the ILD, which was International Labor Defense, and the Communist Party. So the Communist Party managed to actually defend the Scottsboro boys and put so much pressure on the government that the Scottsboro boys were actually acquitted, thanks to the Communist Party. Yeah, go ahead. Now, at this time, you had a great organizer and really unique American, just in general, Angelo Herndon. Now, Angelo Herndon heard about what happened with the acquittal of the Scottsboro boys, and he was really impressed by this. So, in Georgia, he helped to organize he joined the Unemployment Council in Georgia, and later, through this, he joined the Communist Party in Georgia. Now, Angelo Herndon was actually arrested in Georgia for quote-unquote inciting black insurrection, and this was a law that went back to slavery. And this carried the penalty of death. So the federal government and the state government was trying to kill Angelo Herndon. Now, it was thanks to another figure, and another unique American named Benjamin J. Davies and the Communist Party that put up the legal defense for Angelo Herndon and managed to free Angelo Herndon thanks to the pressure of the Soviet Union, the Communist Party USA, the black community, and the white community. So. There you white, unite and fight. Black and white, unite and fight. Black and white, unite and fight. Yeah, so really amazing things happened during this community, especially in the South. You had massive unemployment councils and sharecropper unions that were formed by the Communist Party. You had white workers who were former Klansmen were burning their Klan cards and joining the Communist Party. So Benjamin J. Davies actually, with this experience of defending Angelo Herndon and getting him acquitted, he decided to join the Communist Party. And Benjamin J. Davies' father was actually a radical Republican. He was around during the Reconstruction period, and he was a radical activist during that period. So Benjamin J. Davies eventually relocated to Harlem, and he started doing organizing within Harlem. And he was actually elected to the New York City Council in 1943. So in 1943, a black American and a communist, was elected to city council in New York not only once but twice. Don't tell me that we cannot elect communists to public office in America, because we did it in 1943. And this was an amazing accomplishment. It heightened the Communist Party nationally, and at the time, the Communist Party was basically the third largest party within America in terms of influence, apart from the Republican and Democrats. A voter in Harlem who knew of Davis and his father actually said that he called his father a Lincoln Republican, and now Davis, in his legacy, was a Lincoln communist. So, yeah. So, going forward, you also have the Civil Rights Congress, which is organized by the Communist Party to fight against racism and to fight against these frame-up cases that the South is getting away with and doing all sorts of horrible stuff. So you have black figures such as Paul Robeson, Langston Hughes, Claudia Jones, Benjamin J. Davies, Henry Winston, Harry Haywood, James W. Ford. These people all helped build the organizations and the connection that the Communist Party had with civil rights and black liberation. And these organizations really played an important part in basically creating the momentum and the foundation from which the later civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s would emerge from. So in early 1950, you actually had William L. Patterson, along with Paul Robeson and other figures, go before the UN. They go to the UN and they introduce a document, and this document is called "We Charge Genocide," which accused the U.S. government of committing genocide against black people through the transatlantic slave trade, through slavery, and through Jim Crow segregation. And it was thanks to the Soviet Union that they were able to basically be able to travel internationally and actually do this. So if it wasn't for the Soviet Union, the civil rights struggle in America would have been set back by a long time, in my opinion, at least. In 1955, Emmett Till, a black youth from Chicago, was murdered in Mississippi. He went down on a summer trip to, where was it? Yeah, I think Mississippi, right? He went down to Mississippi, and he supposedly, there's questions on testimony, the reliability of witnesses. There was some kind of interaction between him and a white lady, and this caused an uproar, and this caused him to be killed. He was tortured in the South and then killed. Now, Till's mother actually allowed an open coffin funeral for him. So the press was allowed to take pictures. And the Communist Party and the Soviet Union, in response to this, there was this just horrible mutilated picture of Emmett Till. They circulated this internationally and said, this is what the U.S. is doing to its own citizens and its own people at home. How do you think they're going to treat you internationally? And this was a huge deal internationally because decolonization was happening at the exact same time. So you had Eisenhower in the U.S. supposedly advocating for an end to colonies, while at the same time murdering black youth in the South and disemboweling them. So this was a huge embarrassment, and this actually propelled the Northern Wing, the Eastern establishment, the Kennedy family, to begin moving and realizing that they had to address civil rights. It was a huge contradiction within U.S. society, and that if they didn't address civil rights, it was actually going to endanger them during the Cold War. Later that year, in 1955, you had the beginning of the civil rights movement as we know it. We have the Montgomery bus boycott. This was organized by a reverend named Martin Luther King Jr. Now, Martin Luther King Jr. was really young, and people pointed this out. But the reason why he was so young was because all of the older black civil rights leaders within Montgomery, Alabama, all the older leaders had been associated or with the Communist Party back in the day. So they had to put him forward as kind of the face for the movement so they wouldn't be drowned down in accusations of communism. But yeah, so you had the Montgomery bus boycott, and yeah, that was in the later 1950s. And to finish this, I'd like to read a section from Angelo Herndon called "You Can't Kill the Working Class." And this is a really beautiful pamphlet that I'm going to read to you. So I'm speaking as Angelo right now. I'm reading this. I remember especially one white worker, a carpenter, who was one of the first people I talked to in Atlanta. He was friendly to me. He came to me one day, and he agreed with the program, but there was something holding him back from joining the Unemployment Council. "What's that, Jim?" I asked. Really, though, I didn't have to ask. I knew the South, and I could guess. "Well, I just figured that white folks and black folks don't mix together," he said. "It won't never do them good to be organizing one body." I said, "Look, Jim, you know that the carpenters and all other workers all over the country get a darn sight less pay for the same work in the South that they do in other parts? Did you ever figure that out? He hadn't. Well, I said, I'll tell you. It's because the bosses have got us all split up here. We Southern workers are just as good fighters as they are anywhere. Yet we haven't been able to get any equal wages with the workers in other parts of the country. We've got no rights to speak of. That's because we've been divided. When whites go out on strike, the bosses call in the blacks to scab. When the blacks strike, the bosses call in the whites to scab. Did you ever figure out here why the unions are so weak? It's because the whites don't want to organize with the blacks and the blacks don't trust the whites. We haven't got the simplest human rights down here. We aren't allowed to organize. We're not allowed to hold our meetings except in secret. We can't vote, most of us, because the bosses are anxious to keep the blacks from voting, that they make laws that take this right away from white workers too. We Southern workers are like a house that's divided against itself. We're like an army that goes out to fight with one hand behind its back and stops because all the men are fighting each other. Take this relief business now. The commissioners tell the whites that they can't give them any more relief because they have to feed so many black people, and that the blacks ought to be chased back to the farms. Then they turn around and tell the blacks that us off, and they get the blacks scrapping with the whites. Now suppose the white unemployed and the black unemployed all go to the commissioners together and say, we're all starving, we're all in need, we decided to get together in one strong organization to make you give us some relief. Don't you think that'll bring results, Jim? I asked him. Don't you think it's foolish to go into a fight with half an army and one hand behind your back when you can have one whole? Don't you think all that an empty belly is a pretty punk exchange for the honor of being called a superior race? And can't you realize that as long as one foot is chained to the ground, the other can't travel that far? What happened to Jim? Jim didn't say anything more that day. I guess he went home and thought it over. He came back a week later and invited me to his house. It was the first time that he'd ever had a black person in the house as an equal and a friend. When I got there, I found two other black workers that Jim had brought into the unemployment council. About a month later, Jim beat up a rent collector who was boarding up the house of an evicted black worker. Then he went on to work and organized a committee of whites and blacks to see the mayor about the case. Quote, today it's the black worker across town, tomorrow it'll be me, quote. Jim told the mayor. There are a lot of Jims today all over the South. Yeah. So, thanks. Okay, questions. Let's get into this.
Dare to win!
Dare to win! All right, questions? Let's sit down. Let's get some questions. Yeah, pass this.
I talked to Caleb a little bit about this yesterday, but I'm still trying to put my finger on it. I've went from knowing nothing about socialism or communism to feeling like there's something, maybe democratic centralism is the answer. I guess to make my question succinct, I want to know how in the world is someone like Xi Jinping able to rise from a cave to the top of the Communist Party in China, but we are not able to break in through some woke liberals that have ideologically captured the Communist Party USA. And we talked about that, but maybe I don't understand the mechanism. Maybe you guys can educate me. Is democratic centralism not the mechanism? Because it seems what we really want is someone that gives a shit and is willing to be killed by the state in charge of the party. How do you get that person? How does that happen? That's my question.
We used to have it with Foster.
Yeah. So you're asking what about the current leadership of the Communist Party and what the deal is with that, or yeah. Well, I'll let a member actually explain that to you.
Unfortunately, Chairman Joman Sims doesn't have as much control as people think he does. He's actually being whispered. There are a group of people that are whispering to his ear about lies about organization as well as patriotic socialism. Even though Joe Sims wrote an article defending why we need to be patriotic back in 2014. There is a wrecker by the name of Taryn Vivek who is being repeating lies in Joe Sims' ears, and they've also been fostering a a culture of liberal identity politics, and even encouraging rank and file members to defend Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris from misogyny.
Yeah, I think we should. We are going to address more of the history of the Communist Party USA tomorrow, but also we should probably not have an intense discussion about this in this venue. We should talk about the history because we are being recorded. We want to be able to post this online.
Well, I didn't want to turn into a
no problem.
who on the Communist Party. It seems like the question.
It's also because there was a lot of the ideological shift in CPUSA during the 90s when the Soviet Union fell, and there was a lot of confusion on where to go. And Sam Webb, unfortunately, pretty much drove down CPUSA towards the ground as he wanted to he wanted to further cement CPUSA to be an extension of the Democratic Party, even though the CPUSA was always encouraged their members to vote Democrat throughout the 60s, even when Gus Sol was still the chairman.
I have no idea how to use this, so I'm just sticking in front of my face, and we'll see what happens. My first question is just the name of that pamphlet that you read from by Angela.
You can't kill the working class.
Okay. Thank you. And my other question is, given this, what are your observations on the state of the so-called communist movement in the country today, specifically in reference to the different periods that the Comintern described as, for instance, the Popular Front period, the United Front from Below period. I guess the question is, what do you see as the stage of development of the Communist Party now, and where to go from here?
Right. I think what we can all see clearly.
Yeah.
I think that we can all see clearly the state of the country clearly. We're entering a low-wage police state. Our bourgeois democratic rights are being curtailed and destroyed by both the Democrats and the Republican parties and by the security-obsessed elite. The orientation, I think, and this is my personal opinion, this doesn't reflect necessarily the policies of CPI or anything like that, but I think the orientation that the communists and a communist party, not the Communist Party in the U.S. has to take, we have to have a Popular Front in order to defend our civil liberties. But this Popular Front doesn't mean defending the Democratic Party or voting for the Democratic Party, because the goddamn Democratic Party and the Republican Party are destroying our civil liberties and our Constitution. So a truly Popular Front is going to include a lot of forces. It's going to include libertarians. It's going to include progressives. It's going to include some conservatives. Basically, anyone who is willing to defend the Constitution and our civil liberties against the existing intelligence agencies and the two-party system. And I think communists have to center themselves in this kind of a new Popular Front. And yeah, and in terms of the current orientation of the Communist Party, I'm not that impressed with it. And, yeah, of course, there's always going to be good people within the Communist Party, but I think that we kind of have to focus and move beyond the Communist Party at this point in America. Caleb, you want to say anything? Okay, cool. All right, any other questions? Go ahead.
I just wanted to respond a little bit to the leadership question and everything else like that. But I think that leaders are forged by material conditions, right? Leaders are, become leaders because of, what they go through in life, because of what has happened to them. And those are, material conditions, right? And, leaders rise up, because of, groups like this that educate and, facilitate this type of, training and education. And, really, I think that that's, what I've been trying to kind of figure out as well. It's a really good question on how do we create leaders? How do we facilitate the training of leaders? And how do we, find the leaders that, that we do already have within our midst,
It's in my gut. I feel Americans might just be still a little too comfortable for the leader we need to emerge. That might be it.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Sam. Yeah.
So, okay, I'm going to shift the topic to the presentation. Right? I see there's a relation between your question and the presentation, but like, I do want to talk about what we just went over. And I was wondering, so I've read through most of History of the Three Internationals, as many here have, which covers a lot of the material you went over. But there's also a lot that you went over that's not in that book. And I was wondering if you have any recommendations for how we can get more into depth with this stuff.
A lot of good stuff you can find on Marxist.org, and like I recommend you read works by Dimitrov of the Popular Front, the theory behind that. And I also recommend you read Caleb's book himself on the Communist Party USA, which gives you a kind of orientation for where the Communist Party USA was at the time during these periods of the Comintern and their specific orientation. Yeah, any other questions? Cool, go ahead.
So first, I just want to say how incredible I thought this lecture was. Like, I think that the grasp of the history of the communist movement in America is such a strength of CPI. I don't feel like I've gotten this knowledge anywhere else, and it's so moving and important. And also, so I have a lot of libertarians in my family. I talk with my brother a lot about like libertarianism versus socialism. And one argument that he always brings up is, you know, like all this progress that socialist states is not unique, that communist states also went through that it's just like the process of modernization or the process of just like being introduced to this, like development. So you seem to know like so much about it. Is there anything that you would respond to that kind of argument with?
Yeah, sure. Modernity, in a lot of ways, was an apocalyptic event for modern industrial capitalist states, particularly in Western Europe. You saw a lot of horrific stuff during modernity. You saw the horrors of the industrial, the big industrial plants where workers, were worked to death almost, had no wages, no livable conditions, and were really in bad straits. You saw the closing of the enclosures in Britain. You saw peasants being deprived of their land. You saw an apocalypse. You saw famines. You saw mass murder. You saw a lot of really ugly stuff during modernity. And if we're going to be honest, yes, serious problems happened in socialist countries during this time as a result of modernity. Modernity as a whole is kind of an apocalypse. It is taking away, it is depriving people of a mode of production and of a means of production and replacing it with another. In terms of the communist response to modernity, I think communists are in a unique position since we're advocating not going backward toward like a kind of feudalistic paths. We're advocating going forward to, a society without scarcity, a society where the economy is centered around the people and is controlled in favor of the people, to where basically we can provide a stabilization factor through modernity, to where modernity doesn't have to be as brutal and as awful as it was under capitalist countries. Because I would argue that imperialism was a key part of modernity as a whole, and imperialism has a body bag toll on it that's I couldn't even get into. Like everything that they say communism, how many people it's killed, if we really want to add up all the deaths of capitalism and imperialism and modernity, oh boy. Yeah. So I guess that would be my response. Communism has a unique element to modernity itself and is able to guide people through modernity while preserving their history, traditions, and cultures in a unique way.
One thing I would add in response to that common argument is that, it's so funny how they move the goalpost. First, socialism never had any success ever anywhere. And then you point out that's just factually not true, right? And so then it becomes, oh yeah, well they did, but the West, they had it too, so it doesn't count, or there was a famine along the way, or there was political repression, so somehow it doesn't count, right? But the point that needs to be made is that, we're talking about imperialism, as Nick talked about in his class, that there are countries all over the world that haven't made this progress. In Central America, take a look at Honduras, take a look at Guatemala, take a look at Nigeria, the top oil exporting country in Africa, and the countries that haven't made this progress, that still have mass illiteracy, that still don't have power plants, all have free trade, and are all part of the free market Western capitalist system. And it was breaking out of that system and breaking out of the Atlanticist open international system and the domination of Western capitalism that enabled the socialist countries to do this. And I think that's the point that needs to be made, and that's what the libertarians are missing when they say that. So I just wanted to share that.
Cool. Any other questions? Gavin, here we go.
I would also say to your brother that ordinary capitalist countries took like 200 years to make this industrial progress and modernize. Socialist countries, some of them took 30, 40, 50 years.
To add on to that, sometimes even quicker. I mean, the Soviet Union went from 1923, Russian Civil War, millions dead, just an utter wrecked situation. The urban proletariat was really wiped out in a lot of ways by the Russian Civil War. It went from that in 10 years, 1923, into 1934, 35, 36, to the first 5-year plans and transforming into modern industrial power. So not just 40 years, Gavin, but 10 years. Just it's unimaginable. We cannot imagine it today.
Let me add also that there are the Asian tigers are a great example. That you get this argument from a lot of times. They'll say, well, look, South Korea, they very rapidly industrialized, Taiwan and these other countries. Well, it's important to note that they only did that because basically for geostrategic reasons, the United States allowed them to do it. First after the Korean War, you had the dictator Syngman Rhee of South Korea, who didn't industrialize South Korea, and then he was overthrown in a communist uprising. It was pretty clear if life didn't get better in South Korea, you were going to have a communist revolution. So then the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administration basically gave permission to Park Chung-hee to industrialize South Korea. But then you'll notice that he got to they got mad at him for doing it, and increasingly over the course of the 1970s, they got angry at Park Chung-hee because they had forced Japan to lend him money and said stabilize South Korea so we don't have communism in all of the Korean Peninsula. And eventually, in 1979, you have Park Chung-hee, at the time that he's talking about getting nuclear weapons for South Korea. For South Korea, so they don't need the U.S. troops there, basically. You have Park Chung-hee getting shot in the face by his own Secret Service, and then the person who shot him being mysteriously disappeared, and it becomes pretty clear, and Lee Kuan Yew of Singapore, right? I mean, he is not a communist or a socialist, but he was somebody they allowed to industrialize Singapore as a barrier against communism and such, and they didn't like him towards the end. And it's very clear that a lot of these, quote-unquote, strongmen or Bonapartists that they propped up during the Cold War out of necessity, really reluctantly, that were able to industrialize their countries, that once there was not a reason to keep them in power, they didn't like them anymore because that capitalism and Western imperialism wants to keep these countries impoverished. And I think that's an important point as well. And that also when we talk about George Soros, at the same time he's funding the overthrow of socialist governments in Eastern Europe, he was also, at the time the Soviet Union was falling, et cetera, he was starting to remove some of these quote-unquote strongmen regimes around the world that had industrialized because they were seen as a barrier to free trade. And neoliberalism was not just about celebrating and overturning communism around the world. It was also about overturning the kind of Bonapartist military states that had enabled economic progress in order to stave off the threat of communist revolution.
Yep. All right. Any other questions before we finish up this lecture? People are hungry. Okay. Yeah.
A lot of us are hungry.
So. Yes, we can eat lunch. Okay.
Tremendous class, Max.
Thank you. Dare to struggle! Dare to win! Dare to struggle! Dare to win!